So a couple of lectures ago, we did a very simple phase plane analysis of a one-dimensional system, and we tried to understand the steady states of the system with stable steady states shown here in filled circles and unstable steady state shown in a hollow circle. Now we're going to do a very similar analysis with this two-dimensional nonlinear system, and now we see that we have these nonlinear or curvy lines, which are the nullines, and the points at which the nullines intersect are the steady states of the system. And we see that there are 5 steady states denoted by these circles, and 3 of them, denoted by the white circles, are stable steady states, and 2 of them, denoted by the hollow circles, are unstable steady states. Now, here we've colored in this graph, and on one axis we have the firing rates for population B that prefer direction B, and on the y-axis we have the firing rates for population A that prefers direction A. And we've colored in this graph with 3 different colors, and the color here, yellow, is called the basin of attraction for this stable steady state attractor up here. And what that means is that if the system is in a state anywhere up here with any of the firing rates of population A and B that lie in this section of the graph here, that means that the network activity will be attracted towards this stable steady state here, and population A will win the competition. We see something similar on the opposite side, and anything in this area of the graph will be attracted towards this stable steady state, and population B will win the competition. But in the middle, where this resting state is, we see that there's a third attractor state, and anything here will be attracted back down to a low level of activity in both populations, where neither population is winning the competition. And this is what we see actually at the beginning of the trial, before there's any stimulus. Activity tends to start with both populations having quite low levels of activity. But when there's a stimulus, what we see is that this changes the attractor landscape. This pushes both of the nullines up. This results in destroying the stable steady state that used to be at this low level of activity for both populations. And now there are only 2 stable steady states in the system, one in which population A wins and a second in which population B wins. And in the middle, there's an unstable steady state. Now, we see these arrows drawn on here, and we see that there are arrows pointing towards this unstable steady state in this direction, and away in this perpendicular direction. And this is because this point here is known as a saddle point, in which there is a stable manifold in which an activity is along this line, it is attracted towards this state, whereas if it's off this direction, it's pushed away in one of these opposing directions. What we see here is the stimulus with a low level of coherence that slightly favors population A. So the initial state of the system, which was down at this stable steady state here, lies slightly within the basin of attraction for this steady state here. So just more than half the time, activity will initially be drawn towards this state here, but because it's in the basin of attraction for this steady state attractor here, it will gradually be drawn towards this state. However, it's very close to this decision boundary between the 2 basins of attraction, and because there's noise in the system, on some proportion of the trials, noise will shift the state of the network into the basin of attraction for population B, and this attractor here, and sometimes the network will make an error and go towards this attractor state, selecting the incorrect action. Now we see that for higher levels of coherence, the basin of attraction for this attractor here gets larger, which makes it more difficult for noise to push the system over the decision boundary into the other basin of attraction. So this will increase the proportion of correct responses. And for a very high level of coherence, you see that the basin of attraction for the other steady state completely disappears. So now we have 100% correct performance. So it seems that we can understand decisions and perhaps the neural activity underlying decisions as movement within this attractor landscape. So this analysis is called a state space analysis because we're looking at the different steady states of the system, and it reinforces the point that the system is not rigid, but it's actually flexible in response to external signals. These can change the number of attractors and the size of the basins of attraction, and this will change both the dynamics and the speed of the decision and the likelihood of making one decision or the other. Now, so far we've been speaking about perceptual decision making, but there's also value-based decision making, which are the kind of decisions perhaps we think about a little bit more often. So in order to think of a good example to connect with the students, I did some cultural research, and I found that in English culture, carrot toys are very important, so much so that people queue up outside of the supermarket Aldi from 4 in the morning in order to be able to obtain their stuffed carrot toy by the name of Kevin. It's become a bit of a problem. In fact, Aldi has put a limit of 2 Kevins per customer. So imagine the situation that you are an English person and you are desperate for your Kevin, the carrot stuffed toys, and each day you want to try and go and buy as many Kevins as you can, but you only have time to go to one Aldi. You can either go to Aldi in South Bristol, Southville, or you can go to Aldi in East Bristol. Now, if you go in the morning before work and you go to Aldi in South Bristol and they have 2 Kevins available, you're more likely to repeat that choice and go back to Aldi in South Bristol the next day. However, when you go to Aldi in East Bristol, even though you've been queuing since 6 in the morning, there are no Kevins left. So this may make you think that it might not be worth going all the way over to East Bristol to buy my Kevins. I'm more likely to make the choice to go to South Bristol again. So this is the essence of value-based choice. And we can see that we can actually extend the simple model we just studied to value-based choice along these lines quite easily. So now we have sensory information that is quite strong, representing 2 options, and however the neural populations that represent the 2 options are connected to our populations A and B through certain weights defined by CA here. And the CA can be thought of as the synaptic strength that can change over time in response to feedback. In particular, if you make a choice A and it's rewarded, you're more likely to increase the strength of the inputs from choice A onto population A. However, if you make the choice and it's unrewarded, you might make it the input onto population A a little bit weaker now. And this is updated as such, a very simple set of equations. If you choose choice A, the strength of the inputs onto A are increased if the choice was rewarded, and they go up towards this maximum value Q. And if you choose choice A and it wasn't rewarded, it goes back down a little bit. And what we can see is that the probability of choosing A with equal sensory inputs, it differs depending on the relative strength of the input weights CA and CB here. And here we can see the results of making these choices over many different trials, here over 1,200 trials. And the line we see here is the probability of the reward if you choose A, and it starts at 0.5, then it goes down a bit, then it becomes more likely to be rewarded, and so on. In red and green, you can see the strength of the synaptic inputs onto populations A and B, and there are very slight differences that A and B are quite similar here. Then green inputs onto B seem to be slightly stronger here, then onto red, and it switches back and forth. And in the slightly more noisy line, we see the behavior or the choice output of the system, and we can see that it quite quickly tracks the probability of getting rewarded. So this system, with this very simple reinforcement learning rule or reward-based learning rule, is able to quite successfully model choice behavior. And this behavior is actually quite similar to what we see in animals and humans indeed performing these types of tasks. So the brain areas that are involved in value-based choice are a little bit different from those involved in perceptual decision making. And in particular, there is a lot of interest in these two areas, the orbital frontal cortex, or OFC, and the anterior cingulate cortex, or ACC. The orbital frontal cortex receives input from areas that have highly processed sensory information. So, for example, how objects look. For example, this gets input to the orbital frontal cortex. The anterior cingulate cortex does not receive as much highly processed sensory information, but it's more strongly connected to motor parts of the brain. So it's more easily able to influence our actions and movements. Both of these regions also receive strong inputs from the dopamine neurons, so that they may be able to update their weights in this reward-based way when a choice is rewarded, for example. Now, I must admit that this story is quite strongly debated in the field. There are certain researchers that think that the orbital frontal cortex is the only really important region for value-based choice. And there are other people that think that regardless perhaps of whether a decision is based on which object to choose or which action to make, this choice happens in a distributed fashion that is calculated across these brain areas and made essentially at the same time across many different brain areas. So this is an active area of research. So this is the end of our class today, and I wanted you to learn how decision making was studied in the laboratory, and we focused in particular on the very popular random dot motion task. I wanted you to learn a bit about computation models of the decision process from psychology, and we studied the drift diffusion model, and we also looked at the race model. We wanted to study a neural circuit model of decision making, and we looked at both the spiking and the simplified firing rate models of Wang and Wang. And these were in fact very similar to the working memory model that we studied earlier. And I also wanted you to gain an intuition into the decision-making process from a dynamical systems perspective. And I think that what I wanted to convey was that we can think about decisions and how the brain makes decisions as movement within an attractor landscape. And so that's it today. If you have any questions about today's class, please contact me on Teams. I'm really looking forward to seeing you back again in person for our class on the neuroscience of consciousness next Tuesday. Thank you.